Yes. Alrighty. So we have kind of two sections to the design slide today. We have kind of an intro to design, and then we have some more on spacing. We were supposed to go intro to design in last week, but we kind of ran out of time for that. So we just allotted it to today. But shouldn't be anything too crazy. So yeah, let's just get into it. So what is design? I think a lot of people can try to encompass design as just like, oh, that looks pretty. And like, or design is just purely aesthetics. Everything like is designed just to look pretty. But it's actually not quite just aesthetics. It's not just making things look pretty, and it's more of a breakdown to it. Ultimately, design is more about problem solving, which some of you might think, how is that? I like to think of design as like 5 different layers. On the surface level, it's the visual design. It's what we see on an everyday today basis. Let's say like the room, let's look at Moffat 102, for example. We have like these cool little geometric looking thingies on the side of the walls. Um, I don't know why they put that, but I mean, visually, it might look more appealing than a blank wall. And then let's go down to the next level. We have a skeleton, which is the interface and navigation design, or like kind of information design, where we kind of break down, let's say a website into like parts, like, oh, we need to have a homepage, we need to have like an about page, other stuff, all that yada yada. And then after that, we have our structure, which is more kind of like the UX side and kind of architecturing our where to store information. Then we have below that our scope. What does our website need for content, for features? And lastly, this is the side of design that people kind of forget or don't really know about, which is strategy. What does the user need and how can we design a product around that? So we'll get into all of this more, but this is kind of like the overarching structure of what design is. There's also many different types of designs. You guys have probably heard of all of these, like visual design, graphic design, brand design, product design, all this cool stuff. But in our course, we'll mostly be focusing on these three: user interface design, user experience design, and human-centered design. So let's start off by defining UI, user interface. You might have heard UI, but maybe you haven't really heard like, oh, what is UI really? So UI can be defined as a space where interactions between humans and machines occur. Essentially, this is kind of what you may input into a device and software, and it's not necessarily digital, but it can also be something like when you're using a remote control to turn on a TV. Next, we have user experience, also known as UX for short. This is referring to the overall experience of a person using a product, such as a website, computer application, especially in terms of how easy or pleasing it is to use. And lastly, human-centered design, also known for short as HCD. HCD essentially is a design approach that incorporates human perspective, like why should we design this around what works best for humans? So it's very common to like mix up UX and HCD. Like user experience is more about who uses it, which in some cases might not always be humans, and how to create an optimal experience for them. Whereas HCD really centers around human-based like design, where how can it work best for humans? And it's not, and it has to do a lot about accessibility as well, which later design lectures will go into. It's basically where form meets function. They must work in tandem, and aesthetics is a very large and enjoyable part of UX. There's a lot of talk about how people like come into a design course and say, I'm not good at design. I want to learn how to get better at it. But for some reason, like my design always looks bad. Like I only know how to code. I always hear that. Like there's a lot of people who are just really scared to design because they think, oh, I'm a bad designer. But in all honesty, design is something that some people may say it's innate, but I think with practice, anyone can get better at it. You have to surround yourself with inspiration, and I think a lot of design also has to do with like taking inspiration from other designers you might like. So at first, when you're starting out in design, you might think like, I don't really know where to start. But even in just the world around you, can take inspo and see, oh, I like how that looks. Maybe I can incorporate that in something I'm designing. And furthermore, I think I've also said this in the beginning, but just practicing, recreate an app you really like. I think a lot of design, whether people like realize or not, is just you just gotta practice. Yeah. And then now we're just gonna get into fidelity. If you've heard this term before, essentially, in its basic form, it's like a prototype with expression of design intent. We prototype so that designers can present their designs and then see them in action. So the first type of fidelity is like a low slash mid fidelity. So in this example on the slide, you can kind of see it's kind of the blueprint or like a wireframe for like web pages or like app screens. You can see a lot of this. There's not a lot of details. It's like black and white, and it's more of a big idea rather than the little details. This is kind of where you start when you're designing something. You don't want to always flesh out a website at like with all the colors, typography, and all that stuff, because you want to make sure, oh, what content do I need on this page? What features do I need? I need an image here. I need my logo here. I need to feature like X, Y, and Z. So you want to kind of plan out and map out where you want all the aspects on the website before fully fleshing it out. And then after you finish your low slash mid fidelity mockup, then you have your high fidelity. So your high fidelity like mockup is essentially your like yassified version, I like to say, of your low fidelity one. You gotta include all your fancy fonts, your images, colors, all that fun stuff. And this high fidelity mockup is kind of like before you, if you're working with a team, if you're the designer and you're presenting it to a team of developers who are going to bring your product to life, you want to be able to make sure that those developers can see the vision in your head of how you want this design or product to look. So it communicates to your team the exact design you have in mind with, as you can see here, like the low fidelity one looks very different from the high fidelity one because it has a lot more life to it. So whether you're going to be the one developing the final product or you're working with the team, it definitely is still a good resource to have. And now we're going to get into interactive prototypes. This is definitely something that has become more common. Now getting to 2023, a really big thing is like motion design. And like when you're making prototypes, you want to make it very interactive. So as you can see here, like in a lot of prototypes, usually you can see like kind of the static form where you just have this one like frame and it's just one static kind of block. But when you add motion and make it interactive, it brings your prototype to life with these animations that would be in the real product. And it also simulates how your app would work once completed, which is very helpful for developers who, if they're going to make any animation sorts, they could reference your interactive prototype. Now let's put it all together. So on the left here, you can see a very basic wireframe. You just have three components. You have one big rectangle, one medium rectangle, and then one tiny rectangle. On the right, we have our actual website where you can see our big rectangle has transformed into our image. Our medium rectangle has transformed into a kind of header. And then the small rectangle kind of refers to like this body type where it says like the reviews. Now let's translate this into code. So in our HTML, you can see there's one large div tag that kind of acts as our container for everything. So in our wireframe, we can kind of translate this to like our large overarching. Bless you, Chris. Anyways, so on our wireframe, if you can see those little dotted lines, that kind of is our large frame. That kind of acts as like our container of sorts in our HTML. And inside our container, we can see three divs, which kind of act as our rectangles on our wireframe. Our first div is our image. Our second div is our price and title. And our third div is our rating. I think it's very self-explanatory, but as you can see, it's very, you could just translate what you have under wireframe into code using like, I like to think of each tag kind of as like a box on a rectangle. Oh yeah, I was supposed to go through this, but yeah, just rectangles. We also mentioned this in our lecture last week, but for the design aspect of this course, when there's a lot of different like design like software that you can use, Figma, Adobe, Sketch, Illustrator, there's so many, but in our course, we're gonna be focusing on Figma since it is free and it's very beginner friendly to use. But yeah, this is kind of the end of our intro to design before I get into spacing. But just remember, design is something that you can always practice and get better at. So in the beginning, when you're working on design aspects of this course, don't feel discouraged if you feel like, oh, I really don't like how this looks. Like we all will improve over time. So don't compare yourself. If your classmate, you might think like, wow, there's a much better designer than me. You like everyone starts at different places and we all take our own path to get there. Yeah. Any questions on design or like overall intro to design before I get into like visual hierarchy and spacing? No? You can always ask after. But yeah. All right, so let's get into visual hierarchy with spacing, which I think is a very cool topic. We're gonna break it down into two kind of chapters, I guess, importance of space and then macro versus micro level spacing. So importance of space. I'm gonna need some interaction with y'all today. So I'm gonna show like a few pictures and you're gonna tell me what is wrong with the UI of these. So here's our first picture. Anyone wanna say what stands out to you and like what's wrong with this? Yes.
No, it stands out. It's all squished together.
Exactly. Anyone else have any comments? Exactly. You don't really see a purpose. You're like, what is this supposed to be telling me? Anything else?
It's hard to get information and the color coordinates. It's how and identify everything based on the color.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of things that are wrong with this, but I guess the main aspect of this is like it's very cluttered. Here's another example. Some of you guys might recognize this, it's World of Warcraft, but what's wrong with this? Yes, it's World of Warcraft, but it's very poorly, it's a very poorly UI. Yeah, it's kind of similar to our previous image that I showed where it's like just very cluttered. And I think that's a consensus a lot of you guys have said. It's just not very pleasing to look at, one, and two, you don't really know where to look at because there's so much happening. So the UI is just very cluttered. And what is wrong with cluttering? So I think a lot of you guys pointed out it basically overloads you with too much information. Then you basically see like, oh, I don't really know where to look. There's just too much information. So users won't see that much content. There's a loss of visual hierarchy, and then the quality. Why we want to declutter is because quality over quantity. Sometimes we have a lot of information we want to present, but the quality of how we present it is more important than how much information is on there. So this is why we want to use visual hierarchy so that we can give a specific order to the page so you know where to look first. User attention is a very precious resource. I'm sure you guys are very aware, like if you go on TikTok a lot and scroll through like the 60 seconds, like sometimes 60 seconds is too long and you just keep scrolling, but time is really precious. So the amount of time a user spends interacting with something, that is a really important time that you want to be using intentionally. So you want to allocate that to important information first and then secondary information after. And how can we do this? Using space intentionally. So a little terminology before we get into a few examples. So there's two terms, positive space and then negative space. Positive space is what you can call the content. So anything that's like, this is what you can consider like positive space. And then we have negative space, which is empty white space. So this, essentially. It's just space between positive space, which also can be defined as like UI elements. And without negative space, we can't really define positive space. So yeah. Here is a real life example of using negative and positive space. This is the inside of an Apple store. Very like aesthetically pleasing to look at. But if you can see how we have this like kind of like walkway like between the lines of tables that kind of acts as negative space. So that when you walk into this Apple store, you see there's like rows of like devices on top that Apple wants you to look at, they want you to interact with. And there's a huge emphasis on those devices by making these rows so that you're able to like walk through this negative space and interact with what you call UI elements or positive space, which is like the MacBook, the iPhones, and all that stuff. So this is also to show like it's not just limited to the digital interface, but also just an architecture nature that spacing is really important to like the design and layout of things. Here's an online example. I think we all work with Google. Google is like #1 of using negative space to emphasize their website. So you can see here, there's a lot of negative space, like just surrounding like exterior. And then you have your positive space, which is the middle of the website that has the Google logo, which is very recognizable at this point. And then they have their space bar. This is the two, not space bar, search bar. So these two elements are the most, I guess, important things that Google wants you to look at when you like are on their landing page. Because the whole point of Google is like you can literally Google anything, you can search up anything and it's right there. It's super easy to use, and Google does a good job of intentionally putting the focus on this like middle space by like filling the negative space with this like nothing. Here's another example of where if you look at the slide, the first thing you look at is more white space, more emphasis, rather than the very large body of text. It says less white space, less emphasis. Your eye is just more like it's just more attracted to like things that have more surrounding white space. And here's another example. The one on the left is a little less readable. The body of text is much more dense and it's harder to break up things, versus on the right, we have like a larger line spacing in between each line, and that allows our eyes, it's just easy on the eyes, and then we can kind of see and read the words more comprehensively. This is also why teachers ask for double spaced essays. Like teachers are going to be reading like 100 essays and they cannot sit through like all of this like single space text. But yeah. Now we're going to get into macro versus micro level spacing. So essentially macro level spacing refers to the space between like core UI elements of the page that creates the structure and breathing room. Whereas micro level spacing is more of kind of what we just saw in the previous slide. It increases legibility between like paragraphs and chunks of words, and it increases our understanding of text and information. We also have more lectures on that in the future. So here's an example of the Stripe website. Sorry, this is a little slow. On the Stripe website, we can see the first thing that our eyes pay attention to is kind of their payments infrastructure for the internet. This is their, what you can kind of consider like hero section, their main like mission and call to any user that first visits their page. So if you don't know Stripe, they're essentially a fintech company with payments. And let's say you didn't know that. And so you clicked on their website and you don't know anything about them. The first thing they want you to know about them is that they have payments infrastructure for the website, for the internet. So this is centered not exactly in the middle of the website, but as you can see, there's kind of this like larger space to the right, but also there's space to the left. There's like more emphasis on it like closer to the top. So it's like kind of like it's not exactly the top left, but there's like margins, I guess you can put it like that. But this is done intentionally so that it kind of sections out and like separates the other components and like puts your focus on like this section of the homepage. So they use this by using background colors. So it's like there's kind of a gradient in the back, but also there's kind of like a half like white section. So there's a lot happening on the page, but it's not overwhelming like the previous examples that we showed, where you can't really tell what's happening. But here you can tell there's a clear focus. And then as for micro level spacing, this is more of the nitty gritty. So between like the body text, like more information about Stripe. This is like a little like more information, like millions companies of all sizes, from startups to Fortune 500, blah, 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 blah. Like this is just more information about them, but that's not like the most important part. So this is like a small spacing between like their main like mission, and then there's also spacing from their header to their actual hero section. You guys can also see this in like padding and margins when you're ever creating buttons. The padding is referring to the spacing within the border of an element. So this right here. And then margin is referring to the spacing between elements. So if we consider like the submit button, like one element, then we have 3 submit buttons, then the margin is just the spacing between them. And then as for spacing in CSS, we'll also cover this a little more in the homework and later lectures. But there is a few things that you can, in order to create like margins and boarding, margins, padding, and border, then you can just add these to your, there are CSS selectors that you can add. And there's something really neat about CSS called the CSS box model that is used for spacing in web design. So if you consider this like 40 by 40 like box as your element, let's say the submit button that we had earlier, or like submit the text. And then we have our padding, which would be, let's go back a slide. Like the padding would be like the spacing between the border and the submit like box. And then our margin, which is like 32 pixels in this case, it would be like the space between all of these submit buttons. And then another thing that spacing also talks about is line width. So narrower paragraphs are easier to read and there's just less scanning for the eyes. Here's an example. This is medium. So you can see there's a large like block of negative space on the left and the right so that your attention is focused in the middle and that you can kind of read this easier versus if you look at this example where this block of text is way harder to read because you have to scan the entire width of the device versus if you like set a manual width, let's say 960 pixels, so that you have this kind of negative spacing on the left and the right, and it's easier to kind of read and it's just much easier on the eyes. So some metrics, this is like a little more technical, but it's not really defined on like what metrics you have to use. But basically margin and padding around element should be consistent and equal. And then we can use simple multiples for spacing and other metrics, but you don't have to. But just to make things simpler, like try to use like, I personally like to use like by fives, like 20 pixels, 15, like 10, 5 for like padding or margins. You can also use like 2s, like 12, 16s. It really is up to personal preference. So that's why like we don't want you to like, you don't have to stick by one, but definitely it's just gonna be up to you for like how you want to set your margin and padding. And also simple is not the same as barren. Barren is like overuse of spacing. In this example, the fall 2015 website of CS61B by Hilfinger is a little too barren, and it kind of separates the elements to where it's almost like you don't know where to look. So let's have a little closer look at this. As you can see, we have like a bunch of links and they kind of seem like, oh, they should be in a list or like there's an order to them, but you don't really, they all kind of look the same and you don't know which is important. Where should I look for first? There's like general course information about staff, like lecture notes, but like everything just looks the same. And there's almost too much negative space. And that basically creates like no positive space because everything is the same and there's no visual hierarchy. And now if we compare this to the current 61B website, which has a lot more fun design. This is also in dark mode, which we will cover in later lectures. But essentially, we have a lot more emphasis and focus on certain items. So like at the top, we say CS61B, data structures, blah, blah, blah. And then we have announcements. And notice how the line width is like not spanning the entire like browser so that you can have a kind of like an emphasis on like, oh, these are announcements you need to read first. And then after that, they kind of have a calendar. And then they also have a header, which the previous website didn't have. that kind of focuses, oh yeah, if you need to navigate, here's like where you can look at. So yeah, avoid the barren. You want to make it simple, but not overly barren, because you want to make sure spacing is intentional in order to create that visual hierarchy. Another thing is creating rhythmic structure. Notice how on the website, I don't think the lighting in this room makes it noticeable enough, but if you want to take a look on your slides later, maybe essentially this part, this part is kind of considering like the header. This is like your like first landing page, and then right here should be like I can't tell from my angle, but basically there's like a kind of background color change. It's very subtle on the screen, but if you want to look on your slides later, it's basically like a shift from a white to like a gray. But this is kind of like a rhythmic structure that a lot of websites utilize to show like, hey, this is a change or a shift in content. So we're gonna go from like our main mission to like, or like, oh, here are some companies we worked for or something like that. And so like, oh, here's our product. So the space and content structure are used to define this rhythmic pattern. And then symmetry and asymmetry. I think Instagram is a very, very popular, it's like social media app that people can notice like the three items in each row. This grid is just like very Instagram. It's very symmetrical, but there's also kind of like asymmetry to Instagram, if I want to say. There's a lot of symmetry where you have the rows and grids, which creates balance with repeating patterns, but also you can see how after we have like our actual like posts, we have like highlight reels, which are like little circles, which are also symmetric. But then we have our larger circle, which is our like profile pic. So like our profile pic is like usually larger, and we kind of want to show that as like this is our profile pic versus like our highlight reels. You want to like differentiate between that. So it's like symmetric, but not like completely symmetric. So it's they have like asymmetric like aspects. And then like for other websites that utilize asymmetry, this is one weight shift where we have like an emphasis on Adobe, and then we have Twitter here and like all the other stuff, but we have a bigger emphasis on Adobe, which we utilize through asymmetry. Lastly, just some things to know. This was a lot of design concepts that then again, there's a lot to design that's conceptual. So we'll have some cheat sheets for general topics, and we'll like post it on Ed when we release them. And if you're interested in learning more about like current design, because honestly, design changes a lot over the years. What's trending one year like can be different next year. There's like this Medium article that I read a few weeks ago about 2023 design. Really, really cool. There's a lot of emphasis on like motion in design, which I kind of talked about earlier. But yeah, and then lastly, please make a Figma account or have it downloaded on your computer. If you can't download it, if not, then you're like totally welcome to just use like the browser version. But please make a Figma account by next Thursday. We'll be having kind of like a Figma demo in our lab, not next week, but I think the week after. And then we'll also make a post on it about further details. But yeah, any questions about the design aspect, or if you had any layered questions about CSS, I can also answer for it. If not, then here is the attendance link. Go back real quick. It's my Zoom.